Edward Nyamwela from Bangolo, Malawi, is a 20-year-old scout leader and farmer who passes on all he learns to the young scouts that he leads. My land is not that far from home and is located close to the road where people always pass by. I had been quite hungry hunting for knowledge of farming to change the situation of my land and become more productive. I had been doing my farming activities on this land for so many years with no pleasing yields. Edward witnessed devastating losses of crops and soil in the Bangolo community due to wilting, flooding, and erosion. After reaching out to T&E and receiving directions about deep bed farming through the website and WhatsApp, Eddie said, "I need these simple methodologies that conserve soil fertility. I am hungry for knowledge, and I believe my life will totally change." In May 2020, he decided to give it a try and set up his farm exactly in line with the description of deep beds on the T&E website, checking his work by sending photos to T&E's training team, learning about no-till and mulching, raised footpaths, and control of surface water movement. He found that the top 8 inches of soil was soft, but below that was rock hard, so he decompacted it all. Later in July, he says, "The soil color has totally changed, and my seedlings of cabbage, onions, tomatoes, and potatoes are growing well. It has been raining for 2 days, and my furrows have kept all the water." By August, Edward was so excited about his farm. All the older farmers around were coming to visit to see his crops growing so much better than his older and wiser neighbors. He says, "During the day, my neighbors' vegetables wilt in the sun, but my plants in the deep beds are strong and healthy all day. Some farmers get close to me just to grasp more knowledge about it." Sadly, in September, his neighbors who farmed the traditional way had their crops wiped out by a flood that washed away the soil and the crops. These farmers are now keen to adopt the flood-preventing and water-conserving methodologies of deep-bed farming. Edward now plans to set up a business supplying vegetable crops to the local hotels and restaurants. He has a group of farmers who meet to plan the future. Indeed, at 20 years old, Edward is the future. All this training was carried out with the energy and commitment of one young man. The next step is to expand the number of farmers using deep beds in the area, and once funding is obtained, a full-scale program can be put into motion for the whole community. Edward will be central to this, and who knows, may become T&E's newest trainer.
Our next speaker, Mark Shipperlee, is coming to us from Northern England, where he has been involved in biochar, in both making and selling, as well as being a part of the biochar community in Northern England for the last 5 years. And he joins us today to share some of his observations and curiosities from his time in the woods, working with biochar and in agroforestry. I'm excited to hear what he has to say, especially since I think the implications for biochar have potential to help us understand how to interact with forests after the forest fires are going through. I know here in Oregon, after forest fires, loggers go through and do what is called salvage logging, which is where they go through and take all of the dead and dying trees. But since we're all dying at some point, this doesn't do much to protect those trees that are still standing, that could serve as a foundation for those mycorrhizal networks to regenerate and reestablish that forest. And as we know from the 2003 Biscuit Fire here in Oregon, removing that charred biomass does have a negative impact on that soil, or both the soil and the forest regeneration. But I'm curious more specifically even about what we can learn from biochar research to understand how charred wood can foster biology, as well as what kind of microbial foods are in that biochar wood. I think we have a lot we can learn and can have major implications for how we interact with the forests that are currently being ravaged based on our current management of the earth, with the way the water cycle has been manipulated. And so, to hear some of his explorations and what Mark has learned from biochar research in the past 5 years, here he is, Mark Shipperlee.
Hi, Good day. My name's Mark Shipperlee. I'm not sure what time of day it is in your world, but I hope it's been a good day for you. I'm here today to talk a little bit about a product called biochar. For the last 15 years or so, it's stirred quite a lot of interest around the world. You'll hear different views, people using it different ways, people totally agreeing with it, other people disagreeing, saying it doesn't do anything. So I'm not coming in to give you the gospel on it. I'm coming in to maybe give some insights and some observations. I'm here to just say, this has been my journey with it. And this is some of the things that I've understood that other people are doing with it, are working with it, creating with it. I think they introduced me in the website as an expert. I really want to sort of back away from that a little bit, because actually a lot of people have put a lot more time into biochar in a professional way. I've been a beneficiary of these people, from their learnings, their writings, their investments. So I think they're the experts, the researchers, the people that have spent time of their lives and energies writing to explore what it is about biochar. Is it doing what we think it's doing in the ground? Can we use all sorts of things for making biochar? Not necessarily just wood, but can we look at sewage waste? Can we look at husks from corn or from coconut? There's lots of research going on, lots of papers ongoing all the time. And as you can imagine, dealing with a product that's affecting soil processes, there's a lot of quite technical work to work out. Then you've got all the bulk producers, the people who have decided it's a method of getting rid of waste material that can then effectively be used to go into the ground. So they've invested on design of machines, massive machines in places, very simple, small machines in other places. And then you've got the marketeers, the people who've got the message out to people to tell the world this is what's happening and to get the product on the move. So they're the experts, I believe, not me. Me? So I said, my name's Mark Shipperlee. I live up on Hadrians Wall, literally on top of the wall in northern England, in the final northern county of Northumberland. I spent a lot of my life in trees. I came out of college and formed my own tree surgery company. If you're from the UK, you'll remember Hurricane of 1987. That was my era of tree surgery. So fairly dramatic times where we learnt a lot about upturned trees and actually what level of root systems trees had, as opposed to what we were always expecting them to have. So I've been involved in that side, but I've moved more now onto woodland managing and still a small level of working. I'm responsible for areas of coppice, where we're trying to reinstate hazel coppice that probably hasn't been managed for 30 or 40 years. I'm looking at helping farms get into putting more trees on the land in forms of agroforestry, or to help with mob grazing as we move towards these things. And I grow my own food and my own veg. My fruit is coming from trees. I do my own apple tree grafting. We're trying to encourage orchards. And I have a couple of small community interest companies, non-profit businesses, supporting tree planting and woodland creation, and also supporting fruit tree growth. So I'm here today, as I said, not as an expert, but I'm hoping to come and explain part of my journey and bring some of the knowledge that I've gained over time and actually hopefully create some intrigue for you. Not just intrigue, but also maybe answer some questions that you have about biochar. Or might I actually create even more questions about biochar for you? Maybe there's some enlightenment that comes out of the end of this. Hopefully there's more people out there that know more than me and have some very clear answers, because at the moment it's still very young in its game. It's very young in its game for us. But actually this goes back to a long time ago, from the start of the modern world, as they'd say, AD or CE, and even before then. And if we take a ride down to the South American rainforests, there have always been people in the rainforest. As you know, the rainforest is very dense, very high canopy, doesn't let a lot of light through to the ground. But these people needed to eat. So they needed to be able to grow annual crops and to feed their livestock. And they had a process called slash and burn, which is pretty well talked about. And the idea was they'd clear small glades in the forest where they could then build shelters for themselves from the material, and they'd have enough light to grow the food that they needed and the feed for their animals. And this was called slash and burn because they cut the stuff down and then they charcoaled it. They burnt it. the stuff that they didn't need to actually build their structures or anything else. They weren't selling timber outside of the forest. They weren't those sort of organisations. They were just looking after themselves. Very, very small indents. Nothing like we see today in terms of fires in the forests, but just small things that actually, after a few years of them moving on, would quickly grow over. The canopies would come back in, the small floor growth would go up, and the forest would disappear, that whole place where they'd lived. There was explorers were fascinated by the Incas, fascinated by all the different situations that were going on, and the rainforest was very different to today. It actually had significant numbers of people in it. There's explorer Francisco de Orana from the 16th century. He reported that there were many people there. He was sent out by his brother to go and find El Dorado, go and find where all the gold was. Well, he found and discovered a bit of a gold, but not the gold that they were expecting, the conquistadors, the Spanish were expecting. But he found what they call terra preta. And when he describes it, the whole society wasn't a few Amazonian Indians just living by themselves, but it was a full society gathered along the banks of the Amazon in many places, trading, moving stuff around, very clearly successful despite the heavy forest cover over large parts of the land. So people started to look into this product called terra preta and to try and understand it. The illustration on the right here talks about looking at the depths and actually saying what's normal in a rainforest. Rainforest soil's very fungal heavy, not necessarily a lot of humus in there. A really good process, but not much. Quite a lot of humus, but not much soil structure underneath. But where they went to these places where they presumed people had lived, they found this huge depth, sometimes a couple of meters of this soil, this dark, very rich soil called terra preta. And this was clearly a product that was coming out of the tribes that were living in those areas at the time, called them tribes, communities even in those days. And it was observed that actually this stuff was quite magic. It didn't just be itself through all the charring and the burning of everything that was happening. And it wasn't just the burn at the start of the clearing, but they burnt everything that they didn't need anymore, all the waste. So the waste food, presumably probably dead animals, bones, anything around, bits of wood they didn't need anymore. So they did the burning, and this seemed to create this terra preta. But there's an observation from William Woods of the University of Kansas which probably sums up the magic of terra preta, and it says it improves itself. So this is a soil that could actually work its way forward, moving into soils around it, infecting the soils either side of it, and actually getting better and better just by itself. That's some sort of magic. That's some sort of alchemy. That's not where we're at with biochar yet. And that would be an amazing thing to discover, but we don't have all that information. And sadly, as you'll know, the memories of the Incas stayed with the people and with the storytellers because they didn't really write much down at all. So we move back to now, to 15 years ago or so, and suddenly the word biochar started arriving on the scene. This new thing, this soil improver, this thing that did amazing things if you put it in your garden. And it came out to market quite early on the basis of thinking of things it could do. So it was sold through garden centres, it was shown on TV, it appeared on Gardener's World, the UK BBC programme. They used it for about half a year or so, demonstrating with it. It's been illustrated to be used to work with tackling ash dieback, the disease that sadly is taking a lot of our very traditional ash trees from the UK. So there was a lot of stuff out there, and people were starting to use it for themselves. And thankfully, because we're in the 21st century, there's a lot of communication online. We can learn a lot very quickly. And research programs were set up in universities around different places. So the internet became awash over the years, and still is today, with papers written about different elements of biochar, the pros, the cons, is it right, is it wrong? Even a couple of days ago, I saw another paper disputing some of the things, and then went to an amazing seminar based with redwood forestry in the States about the things they were doing. And it's great just to connect with people around different parts of the world who are doing their stuff with biochar and understanding the basic concepts and seeing how it can work. And as well as the research programs, there were networks set up. We have one in the UK, there's one in America, there's one in Australia, there's an international one. They don't hang together hugely well. They're not pulling everybody in together. There's lots of people making biochar at vastly different scales. And I think that's the issue, is that some people just want to get on and do it. They want maybe dig a small earth pit. Other people are investing significant sums of money and looking to see how they can really make it work. So there were networks and things were occurring. Also, publications started to appear. There's just a collection of books there. I'm not particularly pushing any names or any people, but as you can see, there's quite a variety. Big, significant books that are manuals of papers that have been produced. And then people's writings. There's some from the UK here, some from the USA, one from Australia. Very interesting stuff. So I just grabbed these off my shelf, but there is a whole range of them. And to be honest, even the Wikipedia entry for biochar these days is pretty in depth. So really, I want to talk to you about my journey with biochar, what I've done with colleagues and friends around me. We heard the first whisperings about it in 2014, and we managed to get the temporary loan of what was called a carbon catcher with this sort of three-legged drum thing with a big pipe sticking out the top. Probably quite a primitive version. We found it quite a useful thing to make some biochar to start with, so we could start getting trials growing. I wanted to test it on my food growing. I wanted to be able to do field trials of what we could do. And so we gathered materials, followed the instructions. This was on loan to us from another organization, so we were able to learn from their experience about settings. It's what's called a batch process. That means you fill it up and you light it, and then it burns down, and then at the end the twig falls out and you get all these amazing sparks at the bottom and all your biochar falls on the floor. So a very, very rudimentary system. The great system about this was it would be an easy way to capture heat, and that is one of the challenges of biochar. So we could actually, instead of that silver foil around there, we could actually have put a pipe in there if we'd installed it in a building. Having had to play with that, I realised it was only going to produce fairly small amounts of biochar, and I wasn't into huge investments. So a couple of us together decided to invest in what's called the contiki kiln. This comes out of the Ithaca Institute in Switzerland, and there's a design of a cone that's basically it's had the bottom of it cut off and then welded flat is the best way to describe it. There's no air inlets in the bottom. It's actually just designed to draw air in from the top only. So we acquired this. I'll explain a bit more about the burning side of it. The contiki, the way Ithaca work with it is there's a small commercial one that you can buy from them. There's a significant over 2 meter size one, which is basically just the width of a truck, so 2.4 meters. You can buy that from one of their suppliers. But the middle size one, they've been very kind to leave as open source drawings. So we're able to get these made locally. So my local blacksmith was able to make this for us, which was a great thing. It meant local work and stuff like that. On the technical side, if it is just your blacksmith, they will have to find somebody that's got special rolling mills to roll that curve for the steel and stuff, because that is quite a challenge. So anyway, we invested in the contiki, and then we decided, right, we'll have a go, see what we want to do with it. So we started trials. Here's a couple of trials. On the right, you've got the wonderful Sapo Mira potato. At this point, which we were just putting biochar in the soil under the plants. We'd learned that you're not supposed to put it right next to the plants, so we'd scoop out, put some biochar in, untreated, just as it was out of the kiln, but cooled, cover it with a bit of earth, and then put some plants in. You can see here the potato difference, even just at the growth stage, something was happening. And if you look on the left-hand side, we were doing experiments with what we call droughting. So we were growing cress in different percentages of biochar, and the A screen, which is the jar on the left, that had no biochar in it. And we went all the way up to 75%. This is the 50% one. And we stopped watering once the cress had started growing. We let it grow to about 1 inch or so, stopped watering. And this is the result after 10 days. The cress that doesn't have any biochar in it and is just made of soil, that's dried up, that's died. but the one that had biochar in it has been supported and has kept going, and that's 50% biochar ratio. So there's things that are definitely happening with biochar. It wasn't just some story. We were observing that things could happen. So we got into the game and started to market it. One of the biggest discussions at the start was, do we sell it by the kilogram or do we sell it by the litre? And that's a really interesting one, because if you char hawthorn and then you char willow, like willow is half the weight of hawthorn. You know, hawthorn's a very dense, solid wood, and they've had this issue with the charcoal market as well. So the general view was that it would sell by the litre. So if you're selling by litre, you need to have a volume. So we're basically able to acquire buckets. We ended up getting second-hand buckets, reusable buckets, and we were selling it. But we were also giving away 100-gram packets of biochar, and then with instructions, and getting people to have a go with it themselves. We had to tell people what it did. So we were on market stalls, we went to gardening exhibitions, potato days, these sorts of things, because no one really knew about it, or if they're just getting started on it, it wasn't something you could really particularly just put on the shelf. There were some mainstream lines, particularly one that was coming through already and selling biochar with a mixture of other elements into it as a product through the garden centres. So we had quite a lot of interest. We did quite a bit of stuff with it. So biochar, what is it? So it's basically a product that's created by charring. So you create it in your fire, to be honest, as part of your process of creating your heat for your house or whatever. It's about burning in an oxygen reduced atmosphere. So you imagine your fire. If you quenched your fire at any point that it's burning, all the wood that's still not burnt would obviously be sortable. Then there'd be a lot of white ash that washes away, and you'll be left with black chunks. And those black chunks, in effect, are a charcoal of one form or another. And so it's how we make that process more efficient. So the reason it's worked in the fire is that at different levels of the fire, the oxygen isn't getting through as effectively as it could do. And so the aim with making biochar is that you're producing a char. You're not letting things burn to an ash. You're basically getting rid of all the lignins and all the non-carbon materials that are in that. So you're left with just the char and the charcoal. And you can make it from a range of things. Our focus, as I mentioned, is about wood. You can make it from plant stalks, from hemp, from corn. Some people have chopped up old pallets. Woodland waste is an area we're looking at. Husks of coconut, and even pelletized sludge and stuff like that. The sewage waste. We're just looking at different ways that we can be using it. But the debate then isn't, so part of the journey with biochar is also about heat, how they can make heat systems with biochar. So it's not just about the soil improver. It's got two elements. We are focusing on the soil side of it and what it's doing for plants. But there's people out there also focusing on how we generate energy. And in fact, the biochar, as the end of the process, is just a byproduct. So isn't it just charcoal? There's always a debate. I chat with some of my charcoal mates and they'll say, oh, yeah, we just put the small charcoal that's no good for selling. We just put that in our compost or whatever, and it's the same as biochar. Victorian gardeners used to add charcoal to their compost heaps, and there clearly is a benefit from putting charcoal in the ground. But there are some issues and some things that I personally have seen to identify as being different between biochar and charcoal. So on the right here, you've got biochar with a great little sycamore seedling doing as they do, get everywhere. And then the left two pictures are basically about charcoal making, which I also do. This is my kiln in the woods. And one of the things I think that defines biochar is the size of the initial feedstock. What are we putting in at the start and what product are we finishing with at the end? If you look in there, we're putting in large pieces. We could be putting a 4-foot long piece of wood into a charcoal kiln because we want the chunks as big as possible. The restaurants that want high quality charcoal want big pieces. So then that middle picture shows what we end up with, and they'll all break up and fracture, but you'll probably end up with chunks of wood that could be 4 or 5 inches in diameter. With biochar, we want it much smaller. We want it gradable up to about 12 millimeters, half an inch at the most. We don't really want big stuff. So to make it easier for ourselves, if you've ever tried breaking charcoal, you'll know it's actually better to start with a smaller product. So don't start with the big stuff. Start with something much smaller. The other thing about is it just charcoal, is how it burns and how the process is finished. So on the left here, we've got the contiki kiln burning itself away. And on the right, we've got my charcoal kiln, actually just about to be finished because one of the chimneys is down on it now. The first difference you'll see in these pictures is smoke. So charcoal kilns traditionally were used this way in the forest, where you had chimneys and the chimneys were pushing the smoke out, and you judge how well the kiln is doing and where it's burning and stuff like that, partly by what's going on with the chimneys. What color is the smoke? What's coming out of the top? With the charcoal kiln, especially the contiki like we've got, you can see a very different process. This is a process called pyrolysis. This is where the wood gases are getting burnt off. And so it's burnt in a very different way. And we have a design here where the air is heated up, comes up the sides of the kiln, rolls into the kiln, pushing the wood gases back down, and so it gets reburnt. And so it's quite a clean fire. So there is a difference there. Now charcoal has moved on a bit. We have retorts now where charcoal can be made in a much cleaner environment. But traditional charcoal making, which we still practice in many woodlands in the UK, is based on, you can't see anything at all. You will only get the message by seeing how hot the kiln is by throwing water at it in various places. But basically, what's the color of the smoke and what are the changes that are going on in your probably 24-hour burn. Whereas with the biochar, we're looking into the kiln all the time. We can see the wood turning to char. We can see it turning to ash if we don't carry on feeding the process. And so there's two differences there. And the other thing, which I think is most important, doesn't really get discussed much, is actually how we finish the process. So with charcoal, the traditional way to finish that would be we block all the air ports. So there's 6 ports around the edge which can support chimneys. We basically fill those up, and it starves the whole kiln of oxygen. So therefore the char goes out, and we leave it 24 hours and we come back and hope that there's some char in there. And that's our charcoal. With this process, we keep adding wood to this until it's up to the top full of charcoal or char. And then we basically quench it with water. And what that's doing, that water turns to steam very quickly. And that is washing out the pores and cleaning out what's inside the biochar. And in fact, it's quite alkaline. So there's if you do it in a way that's traditionally done, where you fill that whole kiln up with water to the top, you don't want to be putting your hands in there. It's very, very alkaline. And so it means it's washing out a lot of the ashes, the potash and that sort of thing from within the biochar. And so that's a very different process to stopping it. I imagine that most of the charcoal that's going to the restaurants, a lot of the pores are still clogged up, and it's not really clear through. And these pores are one of the very important parts of the properties of biochar. So it's known as a soil improver, which is, yeah, it is a soil improver. But original thoughts may be that it supplied nutrients, but it doesn't on its own supply nutrients. It is just carbon. But carbon, especially from trees, is full of tiny passageways. Absolutely jam-packed, because we've got rid of all the lignins and all the other things. All the structures that are not carbon-based are removed, as you can see in the pictures below on the left. And there's an example of a nice, 7 or 8 year hazel probably, that's been through the kiln, and you can still see the annual rings. You can see amazing detail, but it's absolutely charred. And the pores that are going through here, these tiny passageways, are very important. That's the main property that we want out of biochar. Because they say a teaspoon of biochar has the same surface area as a football pitch. So you imagine the things that could be attaching themselves to that surface. You imagine what could be running through those passageways. And that's why we want to get it into the ground. It's also very strong. They say it will last for 10,000 years. I'm not staying around that long to check, but it's pretty strong. And so what we're doing when we put it in the soil is we're doing that new thing that we're all being demanded to do, is we're sequestering carbon into the ground. So whatever properties it has that helps the soil, it's also helping us. So when we've charred it, maybe 60% of it has gone up into the atmosphere, but that other 40% is going in the ground, and it ain't going anywhere else for quite a long time. And so that can really help us. So biochar's passageways, they provide routes through for air, water, nutrients, microorganisms. They also hold things, so they're keeping a balance in the soil. So the classic example, you imagine you're watering your tomatoes. So you water your tomatoes, feeding your tomatoes mainly. So if you put some commercial mix in, you water it on. Can you imagine how much, when it goes through the soil, how much actually stays available to the roots of the tomato and how much goes past and has gone away? So if you put biochar in there as well, then that will grab hold of those nutrients that are coming through the feed, or you could put it in soaked already and hold it, and the roots will grab it. This example on the right, this is a pea root, and we pulled it out of the ground, and it's literally clasping hold of those chunks of biochar when it came out of the ground. So having learned a bit more about soil food web and stuff like that, I don't know if it's hyphae of mycorrhizal fungi that are linked in, or whether it's the actual root that's gone in, but it's clear that the plant wants to be around that biochar. And if the biochar is full of great nutrients for it, or it's full of moisture for it, or it's keeping air in the soil for it, whichever way it's going, and maybe even microorganisms that the plant needs as well to serve its needs, then it obviously wants to really live very close to the biochar. So I think that picture for me actually says quite a lot. The plant is telling us that it wants to be in amongst that biochar. Okay, so how is it made? Well, loads of different ways that it's made. I've mentioned already the contiki kiln. We're just a medium-sized producer, but actually there's lots of different systems of the way it's made. Earth pits, people in permaculture projects, people out in other developing countries, maybe just dig an earth pit and fill it full of wood or whatever and burn it. Then you get the oil barrel system on the right, which is there's quite a few videos on how to do a double oil barrel, one inside the other, fill the wood in the middle, fill material on the outside and just light the outside. Then you get significant stuff. That green thing in the middle, that's called an air burner or an air curtain. And this is at industrial scale. If you're clearing forest damage or forest waste, literally machines are coming in with big grabs and chucking it in there, and this is burning through there. And then you have a shipping container sized unit called the Pyreg from Germany. There's probably other makes around as well. And this is a huge heat generation plant whereby biochar is the byproduct. You have two systems. You have continuous feed systems like ours where you can continue feeding it all day, and that's the same for the earth pit. The oil barrels, they're more of a batch process, which was like the carbon capture at the start. So you fill it up, you burn it, that's your job done. So the air curtain, air burner systems, obviously they're big trailers. They have a semi-continuous feed process as well. There's lots of information. There's amazing bits of kit available on the market now. Oh, amazing sums of money as well. And I think really the main way is to identify, if you're spending big money, is making sure it's plugging into a system where you get the heat. And I don't know if you saw the Need to Grow film, but in there it featured the green powerhouse, and behind the powerhouse, the big pyramid-shaped place, was the biochar. I think they called it the dragon or something like that. So a similar rolling drum biochar maker producing heat as well as biochar that could then heat the green powerhouse. So lots of experiments, lots of enthusiastic people spending time and money and passion to try and make this really work. So as I said, ours is the contiki kiln. I mentioned before, we use the open source method, and this is continuous feed. That means when we light it, we can keep feeding it all day until it's literally full. And we decided, working woodland management, that actually the best thing to do was to look at what we could do to get rid of some of our woodland waste. I really believe in using a whole of a tree. If you're taking a tree out, then let's use as much as possible of it. Obviously, you've got your tree trunk itself that goes as saw logs. Then you've got smaller limbs and stuff that could be used for carving or turning and green woodworking. Then smaller limbs still, and they'll go into firewood. But then you've got the brash, all that stuff. What do we do with that? So traditionally in British forestry and woodland management, we've tended to store it in what we call habitat piles. So it breaks down within a few years, so the insects can make homes in it and that sort of thing. More recently, we started to chip it because there's a bit of a risk, fire risk in the woods these days from dry branches and stuff. So wood chip has been one of the processes. But if we chip the wood, I don't know your experience of wood chip. For me, when I put it on my beds or on my paths, within 3 years, it's gone. It's mulched down. So that means all of the carbon has gone back into the atmosphere. So we started to look at the idea, well, how about we make it into biochar? And we make it into biochar for our garden, but actually we could make it into biochar to put some of it back in the woods as well. So that's why we were originally focusing on how we manage it using woodland waste product. And the important thing is with making biochar is you have the right size feedstock. How big are the pieces that are going in there? There's an issue. If you have a kiln and you stack it full of wood chip, there's actually not much space for any oxygen to get in there and stuff, and so the chances are you won't be able to keep the kiln going. And if you put large branches in there, there's loads of oxygen all around it, and basically you'll have too much fire, so you won't be able to stop it all from converting to ash. So we wanted some decent sized pieces of wood. We originally started cutting coppice and moulding it into fascines, bundles of hazel, and then sawing through them about every 7 or 8 inches. And then we discovered this friend of ours, David, with a branch logger. This is similar to a chipper, but it throws it out as mini logs. So it's absolutely perfect, and it feeds it into nets. I didn't want to burn green because if you burn green wood, you've got a lot more things going out into the atmosphere. We wanted to season it, and we wanted to be the right size for us. And the branch logger, this is a Czech product, but I think they're available in different ways. You can get tractor mounted now as well. Fantastic system for us. Still trying to understand how we counteract the deterioration of the orange bags and nets against the seasoning of the wood, but I think there's ways to deal with that. But this is a great way to produce just the right product that we need to be filling in our size of kiln. So the contiki, you basically light it at the bottom on that flat base. You load a fire in, and we find the best experience is to actually make a fire and load it in with a long fork once it's up and burning, because all the oxygen has got to be drawn in from the top. It's not coming in from the bottom. There's a tap on the bottom there. We don't use that. That's if you use the quenching process that they use. So basically, once that fire started going, as you see in the picture on the left, we've got some black and we've got some white, and we've got those great flames going. We want to try and stop the white burning too much. So as soon as you see a bit of ash appearing, you throw the next lot of wood on it. And that reduces the level of oxygen and means that wood under there is charring. As it's a continuous feed, it means we can stand around. It's quite a social occasion. You can cook a bit of dinner if you're very good at cooking at 700 degrees. You could be working for 7 or 8 hours, and you end up with 700 litres if this is full at the end of the day. And you can see what you're doing. So that's the great parts about it. The side that we haven't really sussed, apart from cooking our dinner, is we're really not utilising the heat that's coming off it. Every time people have tried to cap them and this sort of thing, it's actually affecting the oxygen supply, so you don't get the right sort of burn. So that's one of the problems that with the contiki, as far as I can see, is we are giving away the heat to the atmosphere. So cook all your sausages, your burgers, whatever you want to, your jacket potatoes if you're very quick with them all, but actually it's we're not making the best of the heat that we could. And as I mentioned before, the whole thing is pyrolysis. So what's happening is as the wood warms up, it's giving off the wood gases. Now they normally go into the atmosphere, and we don't really want them in there. So what happens is you've got this rim shield around the outside of the kiln, and the air is drawn up around the outside of the cone. And as it comes up the top, it rolls into the top of the cone, and it's pushing the wood gases back down into the fire, and you're getting the flames, what we call the dancing flames. So that's burning off the gases. It's actually burning above the fire. If you look at your own fire at times, you'll see that actually it's not all burning on the wood. A lot of it's burning above the wood. And this is the process of pyrolysis. And this is getting rid of some of the wood gases before they go up into the atmosphere. So that process is pretty critical to us. Interestingly, the one on the right is the mini contiki, which is one of the commercial products that's owned by a contact friend of ours who's actually doing trials with feeding biochar to his livestock. So the next thing is quenching the biochar. We mentioned the difference with charcoal, where we starve it of oxygen, or biochar, where we actually quench it. So we've chosen not to quench it by filling it full of this water that then becomes very alkaline. We actually use the pivoting system and we tip it out onto metal sheets and we extinguish it with water. We're using watering cans. You can spread it out, rake it all out, see where the glowing parts are, and you water it very carefully. And what you're getting majority is steam coming through, cleaning the pores, and then off into the atmosphere. It is very important that you extinguish it, because charcoal of any sort, when it gets oxygen, if there's any bit of a glow in there, it's going to catch fire. So yeah, there's stories of people driving down a road and at the end of their journey, they haven't got anything left. It's all turned to ash. So you need to make sure, it's very important. Part of management of biochar is that you're quenching it. So how we used it, we did trials, field trials in our greenhouse, trying some soil with and some soil without. The disadvantage of my garden now is actually we don't have any land that doesn't have biochar in it. So we're having to trial in pots or trial on other people's land. But we saw a phenomenal increase in numbers of fruit and weight increase. Now we've got the broad beans and the cucumbers there, similar results with tomatoes. And on the right here, we've got another accidental droughting test. We're not very keen on grow bags as a way, but this was in a friend's polytunnel. And basically we didn't water for a few days, but one side we'd ended up putting biochar in with the plants, and it was nearest the door of the polytunnel, so actually there's more chance it was going to get affected. But if you look at the comparison between the one on the left where the grow bag hasn't had any biochar added and the one on the right, you can see a difference. This is again about droughting. This is about holding water around plants, so meaning we can water our plants less often if we have biochar in the soil. There's also been a lot of debate over whether, if you put biochar on straight away, because it's a carbon, whether it's then going to be really hungry for nutrients, including primarily nitrogen. And that was a bit of a concern at the start, but we didn't necessarily see an effect because we were only putting raw biochar on. And if you look at Ramiel wood chip and those discussions now, or Ramiel chipped wood, people are putting it on their beds and they're not believing that while it's on the surface, there's an issue about it competing for nitrogen. But we did look at what we could be putting into the biochar, so it was already activated, already inoculated with something. What we did for ourselves was primarily comfrey liquid, because it's a product we produced and sold anyway, and that's providing nitrogen and potassium, so great at the times of flowering and at the times of leafing. But there's other things to consider. We consider worm teas, compost extracts, a whole range of things could be used to soak biochar in. You could mix it with calcified seaweed, kelp, maybe produce your own if you want to. Rock dust, all sorts of things are probably available, and that's the thing. You can be playing with it and making your own recipe. How else do we use it? Well, it's great. Charcoal's known for absorbing odors, so my hens basically have handfuls of really fine biochar dust, the smallest stuff that we can't use. We put that in with their bedding, and that definitely reduces the odor of what's happening. We put it into the wormery as well in very small particles, because then it's going through the worm and making that magic vermicompost that the worms do as they break everything up and they crunch everything and convert your food into this wonderful soil. So having a bit of really fine biochar in there as well, it works well. I've got a colleague of mine who's actually looking at water filtering possibilities. It's a charcoal anyway, so it could work that way. And there's been air pollution trials at universities. There's things on different pavements that might be able to absorb flood water and things. So there's trials and stuff ongoing all the time. This was just to give a quick 4 identification points of the potential benefits of biochar. So on the left, we're talking about, is it a source of renewable energy? So it creates heat, it creates gases. So there's those opportunities there. Then it also improves soil. If we go down to the bottom left, we talked about that. So this is a great little map. I'd love to put it big, but obviously I'd have cut myself out of the picture or you'd miss half of it. So transforming waste, so getting rid of a lot of our wood waste, but also maybe our sewage, sludge and other things can be sorted out through it as well. And is it climate change mitigation? And that's the big and new one for us all. Actually, is it now time, because we can sequester it in the ground? Is there something that's really valuable, really measurable, and biochar can come into its own in a new way? Lots of research work going on. We're members of the British Biochar Foundation that had some energy for a while. The British Biochar Research Centre was based at Edinburgh University. They did lots of work. Really interesting, but they weren't just looking at wood. So they did look at wood, but then they were keen on this pelletized sewage, sludge, and this sort of thing to understand different things. So the way research moves forward, but we've stuck with the wood. They also created a UK biochar quality mandate, which says this is a good biochar, this maybe isn't a good biochar, because it's very easy just to char wood. So it's how you measure it, maybe sending it away for analysis. Possibly it depends on the woodlands that you're pulling it from. What have the trees pulled up in terms of toxic heavy metals, that sort of thing. We get ongoing requests from universities to give them samples for somebody doing an MSc or a PhD on some interesting study. A good friend of mine has been doing stuff with palm frond charring. And there's all sorts of other things that are going on with it. The air pollution thing was quite interesting. They ran a project where they were working with the community to encourage them to grow food, but there's a big road going through it. So they didn't just put the biochar in the soil, they actually put it on the surface as well. To be honest, I don't remember the results of it, but there's plenty to still explore with it. So the current status for us, we're still selling it untreated, but that's like selling flour rather than selling your bread mix. You put your own ingredients in to make what you want with it, but we just tell you that's the raw good stuff. But we treat all our own when we're putting it in the soil, and we give instructions to people. We're also exploring single species burns for trials. What's the difference between a willow? What happens if we start burning softwoods? What happens to the different hardwoods? The difference between a cherry maybe and an oak. And the thing we're looking at now, clear felling sites, which we're trying to move away from, but still happen a lot in forestry management. What could be done with all that material? These sites become very bare. All that biomass that's there, a lot of it these days now scooped up because there's lots of grants and subsidies, and we're looking at biomass boilers on huge scales and power plants. But actually, when that all those subsidies disappear, what's going to happen with this material? Maybe that's the time we should be scooping it up, attaching a big biomass plant to foresters' houses, which are often in small village communities, and then bringing the biochar back onto the surface, because that surface, when it's clear felled, is exposed to the weather and the elements. It can lose its soil, it can blow away in dust, and it also can wash down the hill. So if we get biochar onto there, it's making the soils heavier. It can hold on to any nutrients, or we could introduce nutrients through it. And it's also going to hold the water up at the top of the hill, or across the surface, rather than letting run off and causing damage. So for me, I think that's a really good way to go. But we need to be exploring it. And as soon as lockdowns and everything over, hopefully we'll start to have some conversations. We've got some appointments due with forestry to start playing with it. But again, at the moment, it is a problem because there's so many subsidies that actually we couldn't compete with the value that it has currently through grants for being used as biomass heating. But the long term, maybe if we're still in clearfell areas, there could be an opportunity that biochar can tackle some of the negative issues of clearfelling. And we look underground. So I've been currently enrolled on the Soil Food Web with Dr. Lane Ingham. Fascinating time, understanding what's going on in the other half of the planet, the bit underneath our feet. Leonardo da Vinci said something like, we know more about the constellations of the stars than we do about the soil we stand on. And it's been fascinating going through the Soil Food Web journey because it's really about biology. So for years and years now, the green revolution, as they refer to it, that agricultural revolution where we started putting on chemicals and managing to kill off the plants we didn't want and that sort of thing, that's been going on since the war. That's chemistry. And actually, we're not necessarily building soil. But if we start looking at the soil biology and working with the soil biology, it makes a drastic difference to things. And we won't need the chemicals that we're currently using, which will reduce costs. It will improve the land. It will stop killing off areas of wildlife and stuff. So the soil biology is really the way to go. And the soil biology will do the chemistry that's necessary. It will find the materials and make them available to the plants. The nitrogens and the minerals and these sorts of things are all available through the Soil Food Web. So that's a great way. This has been really exciting work to get involved with. And there's a little simplified soil food web there talking about the bacteria and the fungi, and they all get eaten by the protozoa, and the nematodes get eaten by the worms, get eaten by the microarthropods. So basically, there's a whole cycle going on underground that's generally releasing nutrients for the plants, and they're available for the plants straight away. So maybe there's a role for biochar in all of that as well. Maybe it can be used to deliver the extracts when we're looking to put them on land. Maybe it'll provide homes for some of these microorganisms and food stores for them as well. Who knows? It also lets water run through it and holds it on. It retains water. It also lets air run through it and can hold air passages. So it's providing a lot of good structure in the soil. And as we're getting more excited about soil and possibly being quite alarmed at what the current situation with the world's soils, then I believe biochar could actually come into its own. The future. So a biochar producer, large scale friend of mine said, maybe we came to the table too early, because actually now this whole thing about sequestering carbon and this sort of thing gives a whole different measure that was never around for biochar in the early days, 10, 15 years ago. You know, we're focusing on improving soils. The government grant system in the UK will be changing radically in the next few years. We hope they'll be about soils, because the alarming stories that come out, like there's only 60 harvests left that came out of the UN, that's not even this year, that's a few years ago now. So time is ticking. We need to be building our soils and we need to be locking down carbon. So it seems to me, actually, there's a lot of opportunity for it. A lot of opportunity for biochar to have a role in the way we produce food, in the way we grow our soils, in the way we protect our atmosphere and bring our carbon consumption down and getting it locked down. Biochar seems to me to be pretty key. But there's still lots to learn about soil, and we need to learn about the biochar's role in it as well. So thanks for listening. It's been interesting. It's a good journey. It's a fascinating product. And to paraphrase Dr. Elaine Ingham from Soil Food Web Inc., we've not studied that bit yet. There is work for someone. So she spent years and years studying, but clearly you can't wrap everything up. She sometimes in a talk find something about a particular nematode. She said, yeah, but we haven't gone down that route yet. And I think that's the same with biochar. We haven't done it all yet. We're not there yet. But anyway, I'd love to chat to you. There's my email address is there, myself and for Soil Alchemist. And Soil Alchemist has a Facebook page that we just set up as well. So I really thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the summit. Some phenomenal stuff going on. So thank you very much for your time.